The other thing is niche is about ideal audience and ideal work, not only. So a lot of people hesitate to position themselves in a niche because they're like, but I can also do this. And I also like doing this other thing. And that's sort of what you're talking about, right? Like, I like helping the TED person and I like this or that. You want to focus on the ideal. If you could do anything, what's the stuff you would choose to do the most? You will still get those other opportunities. I wind up working with people all the time that is not my ideal niche, but it's still a fit and I still like doing it. So it's not exclusive, but you want to position yourself in a way that you're attracting the stuff you would most like to do, the people you can best serve, et cetera. So for the purposes of this hypothetical, I think ultimately you should go and think through sort of what that is and what you want. But for the purposes of this hypothetical, I want to sort of talk through like next steps I would do if I were you, if we were focused on, I really want to help podcast guests prepare for their stuff and maybe podcast hosts as well improve their shows. So here's how I would think about it and also sort of talk about it if I were you. Some of this is you're telling a story to potential clients and people in general about what you do and why you do it. So the first thing that popped up to me when we were talking before is this idea that you are sort of a new version of a media trainer. That in the old days, media trainers would help people essentially deal with interviews, deal with reporters, deal with the press, help them figure out their messaging. And I think if I were you, part of my story would be basically that the media world has changed and that the old version of media training was you were training people essentially on how to interact with middlemen and women, journalists, reporters, who were then going to take their story and tell their story in the media outlet. Podcasts are completely different because now there aren't those middlemen and you have the opportunity on a podcast as opposed to a journalist taking a couple snippets of what you said. Media trainers before were really telling you how to give one or two good sound bites. Now you're telling people, here's how to take advantage of a half hour, 45 minute, an hour conversation where you, even though you're on the show, are able to speak directly to people. And that's what you are training people how to do. And that, to my knowledge, while I'm sure it exists a little bit, there's no one out there that I can think of that is like the specialist in that. And that's really valuable. And increasingly more and more people are being guests on podcasts and multiple podcasts, and both business people and authors and all sorts of people would love to have that skill. So if you go that direction, you sort of start to position yourself that way. The question becomes, how does everything that you do or choose to do, your podcast, your consulting, your messaging, if you use social media, whatever you do, how does every one of those things help accomplish that for an audience and help position you as that guy? And so I'm going to give you some specific examples of things you could do and ways you can tweak and amplify existing stuff that you're doing to suddenly reinforce that and provide that specific value, as opposed to the sort of more generic, I help people learn how to have better conversations. So a few specific examples. One, what if the first 30 minutes of your 1% Better podcast was the typical podcast that you do now, which is great. I'm using 30 minutes. The number doesn't matter. But the first half or 3/4 of the show is that. And then the last 15 or 20 minutes is your analysis of that conversation, explaining why it was good, explaining why it could have been better, pointing out both from a host and guest perspective, look at how this guest handled that question. Look at what they did. Look at me as a host, the opportunity I missed here, or the way I got that person sort of to go where maybe they didn't want to go. So that now, number one, it makes your podcast different. You still get to do the sort of podcast that you're doing, but there's this added element so that people that want to hear a good conversation, but also want to learn how to have one. It's like a post-game show, to use a sports analogy. You still get to do the show you're doing, but it reinforces your expertise. It also makes your show different than the typical show that is just an interview. And if people don't want that, some of your audience, maybe they just want to hear the interview with that person. That's fine. They log off after they hear the interview. So that's one way to take what you're doing and without a lot of additional time, effort, whatever, reinforce that messaging. Here's another example. If part of what you're going to be doing as a core focus is helping people become better guests, what if once a month, the episodes of your shows were people interviewing you so that you can showcase tactics as a guest, not just as a host? And again, you could do the same thing or not, but you could do the analysis then of you as sort of a guest on that episode. Another thing you could do is, what if you produced one less episode of your show each month and instead use that time? Again, this is the limited time thing. So one less episode of your show and instead use that time to go on other people's podcasts, shows about podcasting, shows about PR, shows about book promotion, shows about whatever. Take your expertise on the road and elsewhere. The chances are, if you did that, that would probably be better for you. Again, you have limited time, but if you repurposed one of your podcast times each month to go on other podcasts, would probably get you more than just doing another episode of your podcast. And the key takeaway here with all these, hopefully you can see, is that once you figure out what you want and how you want to position yourself, you can use that as a filter and apply it to everything that you're doing. So it's aligned with that. And that gets you over what you said, where it's very hard to kind of position your niche, right? Those slight tweaks reinforce what you want people to know about you and how you want them to think about you, and ultimately how you want them to hire you, buy from you, work with you.